Right. So we have completed 9 lessons. Today we are discussing the last lesson. That is enterprise risk management. You have weightage of 5% at the exam. Now, this topic, I think I have given you a very high-level introduction the other day, and when we start at the beginning. So all this time we discussed risk in isolation, right? We discussed risk in isolation, each risk type. But when we manage in an organizational context, it is not as what we learn, right? When we learn, we talk about credit risk separately, operational risk separately, and so on. But when you manage in real life for an organization at a given point in time, you have different types of risk occurring simultaneously. And also, when we say enterprise risk management, the idea is we are managing risk holistically. And as you can see, we discussed each of these key risk components separately. And this is something that we discussed at the beginning. This picture. So here there is a big picture of an organization, how different types of risks are connected, and how organization interacts with the external markets. And there are certain risks coming from the external world, and then certain things within the organizations they are operating. Now, what I called is, when we look at enterprise risk management, so from Basel point of view, it clearly expects the organizations to look at risk from 2 aspects. Understand the firm-wide risk profile. That is why we look at individual risk, how we look at the firm-wide risk. Now, when you say firm-wide risk, as you can see, it says aggregate firm-wide exposure information in a timely manner using easy to understand multiple metrics. Right? Aggregate firm-wide risk. Now, when we say aggregate firm-wide risk, it is not about adding up individual risk elements and say this is our total risk. Say, for example, for argument's sake, if I attached, let's say, values or numbers, let's say credit risk is 10, operational risk is 20, market risk is 10, right? And then all other risks, let's say 10. So I can't say the total risk is the sum of these things, that is 50. That is not the case. Because when these risks work together, there are interconnections, interdependencies, and therefore the total risk is not just the addition of individual risk elements. It is like this. The analogy I generally use is, we know fruits, right? We can talk about mango, we can talk about pineapple, we can talk about banana. So when we eat them separately, it has a taste on its own. So when you put all of them together and make a fruit salad, it's a different taste altogether. Even when you take a piece of mango from a fruit salad, that taste is not the same as when you taste a mango separately. Likewise, when you look at the risk holistically, considering all the risk elements together, that's a different situation than merely taking the individual risk in addition. So therefore, that's why the Basel says, when you manage risk in an organizational context, you must try how you understand and interpret the risk as a collection of all these elements. It is not as straightforward as when we calculate the risk or when we measure the risk on an individual basis. Therefore, it's a skill that we need to master anyway. It's an area that in an organization, whoever the party that is managing the risk need to understand and manage accordingly rather than just take them in isolation. So it expects the organization to look at the risk, not just looking at the immediate implication. When the organization looks at the risk appetite, look at from a long-term perspective, right? So immediately, in the immediate terms, organizations may want to take different positions. But that doesn't mean that the organization wants to hold the same position in the long run. So you do not overemphasize on the temporary phenomena and hiccups. You look at from a holistic point of view, in a long-term view, what would be the overall risk of the organization and what would be the risk appetite of the management of the organization. And then only you can set holistic parameters or holistic targets, and then you can control risk. So if I go further, this is a formal definition for enterprise risk. So we call it enterprise risk management as well as integrated risk management, right? These both terms use the same meaning, enterprise risk management or integrated risk management. Because enterprise-wide risk management happens in an integrated manner. That means you look at the interconnections as well. ERM is the process of applying the discipline of risk management to all the risks a firm faces to understand and manage them, not only individually, but also in the way that they relate to each other. Right. And I told you, it is also known as integrated risk management or firm-wide risk management. All these are the same terms we need to understand. Now, as I explained at the beginning, this is a method that provides a big picture. So that helps organizations to make decisions at the overall level, organizational level. So if you want to talk about the credit, you will look at the credit risk. So then your decisions are more towards credits, that domain. And likewise, each of the risk elements, if you want to take it in isolation, you can do so for those specialized, narrow-viewed decisions. But if you want to look at organizational level decisions, then you need to look at enterprise risk, that is the holistic risk. Right. What's the advantage of enterprises? Define a common understanding of risk and common risk language. So when you say common risk language, what it tries to say is that when we look at risk from a different perspective, right? That means the credit risk is looked at separately from a credit perspective. Operational risk is looked at the different angle. We discuss different tools, measurement, and how you look at the mitigation. So market risk, another angle. But when we look at integrated risk, that gives a view for whoever reads the risk to look at holistically. And when we look at aggregating risk, remember we are now aggregating the risk to build the overall risk. When you do that, you need to have a common understanding where you should be able to accumulate all the risk and build a single view of the organization. And it also aggregates risk information from the whole firm across all risk types, asset types, and business lines. You know, we discuss the risk can happen at different levels. So different risk types are there, and we look at the levels. It can be at asset level, it can be at organizational level. Okay. So we discuss portfolio level as well. So risk, we look at asset level, portfolio level, and organizational level. No, now it's the organizational level we are trying to understand. Present the summarized risk information quickly and succinctly enough to enable better management decision making. Right? I think this over and over we are stressing the same point here, so I don't need to elaborate further. So that's the idea. And the next one is important. Compare the firm's risk profile to the available risk capital, because at the end of the day, when you look at the capital adequacy, right, whether the capital is adequate to absorb the risk of the organization, you need a firm-wide, a total perspective of the risk, and the total risk of the organization is matched with the capital base and see whether the capital is adequate. Then use the firm-wide risk view to define and fine-tune the firm's risk appetite. First, we know what risk appetite is. That is the amount of risk the organization is willing to accommodate or willing to absorb. So that you have to look at from an organizational point of view. So this helps you to get that risk appetite assessments much more conveniently when you have an organizational view of the risk. Then also, the last point is even more important when we manage the resources, because when we look at credit risk, those who manage the credit risk might think that is the most important risk to manage in the organization. Those who manage the market risk might think that is the most important risk to be managed. Those who manage the liquidity risk might think that is the most important risk to be managed. And on that basis, there can be decisions, prioritizations, and resource allocation. So it is important to identify the relative importance of each of the risk elements that we have in an organization, so that at an organizational level, you can identify what are the more important risks compared to each other, and then how the organization should allocate the limited resources to deal with them. And that is an important element here. When you manage holistically, then looking at the risk in silos. Right. Then we discussed about the corporate governance in the previous topic. Now this overall risk ERM is interconnected with corporate governance. As I explained the other day, the board of directors function as the ultimate unit of governance in an organization. So the board, and especially the senior management, they are supposed to manage the risk in an overall manner for the organization, so that you look at the holistic picture of an organization. And also, ERM approach integrates the management of all risks. Those with corporate governance responsibilities are able to see the single view of the firm's risk profile. Right? Again, we are connecting this to the responsibility of the board or the people who are supposed to look at the organization holistically. So that helps to do their job better. That's the idea. Right? That's helps to do their job better to discharge their overall governance role. Right. Now, when we talk about ERM, we also need to look at how we link it with the Basel. Right. Now, when we look at the capital adequacy assessment process, we remember we discussed this. This is not ICAP now. Now we discussed about risk and capital management, liquidity, right? So connection of the two. So this has to be changed. It doesn't talk specifically about ERM, but when you look at how the interpretation was given, it expects the organization to manage risk holistically so that you get the firm-wide view. Right? You need to define overall risk exposure. When you define overall risk exposure, that means it captures naturally all the risk types together. Then you have to perform stress tests and scenario tests, and then you compare it with the available capital. That's how you get the capital adequacy done. Right. So as you can see, the first one, getting the overall picture, is what the ERM is also trying to address. Now, when you look at the pillar 2 monitoring, as it entails overall risk management, it is said that organizations that are serious about that level of monitoring will definitely pay attention to this ERM as a priority. Now, there is an important part beyond that, because we talk about different concepts here. This is not necessarily discussed in the Sri Lankan context, but this is coming from the UK. But we have similar concepts, but we don't use the term. So that is called sound practice. Right? Sound practice. It says, when we have risk management approaches in an organization, the sound practice principle re-emphasize what we just mentioned about the enterprise risk management. That means it says that without taking the different risk types in isolation, identify the interconnections among them and manage it. That is an expectation. So they work integrated manner. So they work together. Now, in an ERM approach, because we connect all the risks together, the total risk is seen by the management, and it also shows when one risk is escalating, how the overall risk level is increasing. So that gives a clear picture for the decision makers. So when you look at setting up an ERM program in an organization, can be a bank or finance companies or whatever the institution, there are certain goals that try to achieve. What are those goals? Designing and implementing the methods for collecting firm-wide information on all risk types, asset types, and business lines. So when you set up a ERM system in an organization, enterprise risk management system, you need to have methods to collect all types of information connected to risk from all the departments. There has to be a mechanism that connects. Secondly, the decision making needs to be supported from a holistic, aggregated basis. And then that is reported to the relevant parties for decision. So another goal is, as there is a requirement for banks and financial institutions to assess the adequacy of the capital, this mechanism should support the comparison between risk versus capital. Therefore, one of the goals is to ascertain that holistic risk to compare against the capital. And another goal is, when you manage risk, each function has a role. There are different people or departments with different responsibilities. So then when you have this ERM mechanism in place in an organization, it can set clear goals and also incentives. So you can incentivize the people in an identified area for their performance, especially in managing the risk in a holistic manner. Right. Now, it is easy to talk about the importance of ERM, how we can make use of it, and how we can support the decision. So that is the easy part. But implementing or establishing an enterprise risk management program in an organization is not as easy as we thought. There are a lot of challenges from different fronts. So one is cultural aspects. Now this is a kind of an interesting thing as well. What happens is, in an organization, you have different teams managing different risks, right? You have market risk team, you have credit risk team, you have operational risk team, right? So not only from a risk department point of view, but also from operational, the first line of defense, right? The first line, the operational management, right? Operational management is responsible to manage the risk on a day-to-day basis. And then we have second line, that is the risk department. Third line is the audit. So each of these divisions, each of these teams, when they manage risk, they look at their understanding. They have their own way of interpreting. They have their own vocabulary sometimes that gives them an idea about the risk. So as a result, when we look at a ERM or a holistic risk management, it may not be easy to bring all of them to a common ground and think in the same way. That is one challenge, because in an ERM setup, all the risk departments, each function, each pocket needs to work together collectively to understand. There is skill gaps, right? Skill gaps. Those who are good at credit risk might not be good at operational risk, right? Those who are good at operational risk might not be good at market risk. So when they look at the risk holistically from an organizational point of view, that skill gap can have issues, right? Without control. Therefore, the respective heads or the leadership of those functions, especially the leaders who manage multiple teams, they also need to have an additional competencies beyond understanding the risk type, how they manage these different people with different backgrounds and different skills, and bring all of them together to share the same view, to believe the same concept and act. Otherwise, the same risk when different people looks at or interpret, you can get different assessments. As a result, different decisions as well. So this is something that organization needs to master. I know in certain organizations, this is not practically happening because those who are good at credit risk, they are good at credit risk. So they have no clue about the market risk sometimes. And then for the very reason that they are not really getting involved too much in that, you don't even bother learning as well. Therefore, it is important for the leaders to understand this gap and ensure that they address it. Then we have exception-based escalation challenges. Right? What do you mean by exception-based escalation challenges? That means we discussed when we discussed the previous sessions. So when you have an exception, you need to report that has a escalation matrix, right? So in a integrated risk management setup, what happens is it has a lot of information. It has a lot of information. And as a result, it might require very frequent escalations and reporting, and that might overwhelm the leadership or whoever the people receiving this information. Because when you look at credit risk as an escalation exception, operational risk escalation exceptions, market risk exceptions. So if you look at all these exceptions at individual level, it's not easy to look at the holistic view. So you need to look at the holistic integrated level and set escalation limits holistically, not individually. So that matrices have to be developed. Otherwise, reporting based on individual escalation matrix will not be successful. Right. Then the other challenge is data aggregation challenges. I told you, when we talk about building firm-wide risk, you need to collect data from different divisions, different sections, and different types of risk, and you aggregate them to get the holistic picture. And when you look at, when we present holistically, you have the measurement. That means you need to measure the risk. When you measure, if you can recall, we measure different risks different. Then how we look at holistically, it's a different situation. And time scales, right? Because there are certain risks that are taking place within a shorter time span. Let's say, for example, if you look at even operational risk type of things, sometimes some of these risks might occur within a shorter time span, shorter period. There are certain risks we need to look at from a long-term perspective. So because of these incompatibilities, you cannot see different risk types occurring within a same time scale. So that puts pressure on the people who aggregate this risk, right? Because some risks may not be possible or practical to be collected within a shorter time span. So then you have to adjust the other risk accumulation to be in line with some of these risks. So therefore, these time scale gaps will have issues or challenges when you do this. Next, combining the data. Right. Again, how you are going to add when you identify credit risk, operational risk. So how you put them together and have common parameter or common measure. So these are all challenges. Right. Accountability. Accountability is important because at the end of the day, you have to be able to identify who is responsible for what. So there has to be identified employees who are responsible to work on these risks and then report. And it says you need to look at responsibility or accountability in 3 ways. When sometimes you identify departments or name individuals as owners, sometimes you have the credit risk department, market risk department, okay? Or a person identified as responsible, we look at those departmental individuals. When you identify specifically, they have a clear understanding and ownership that they are supposed to work on it. So that's a requirement, especially when you set this accountability at individual level or department level. Second, when the risk materializes, you know who to catch, right? Because when the risk materializes, it is clear who is the person responsible. Who's the person responsible? And then who's supposed to resolve it? Thirdly, when the accountability is very clear, because when I know X is responsible for that particular risk, I don't need to worry about that because it's clear that this person is supposed to work on it. But when things are gray, when things are not clearly demarcated or identified, there is a possibility that different people might put their head in on matters, and sometimes there may be situations where some people will not pay attention, then no one will pay attention. So therefore, when I know that the other person is responsible for this particular risk, I can conveniently let that person work on it and I can focus on important matters from my side. Otherwise, what happens is, if I try to pay attention to the matter that other person or whoever is supposed to attend because the accountability is not clear, I might miss on the important area that I am supposed to work. That is why it says, when it is clear, everyone knows whose responsibility is it, then they can work. Right. Then we talk about the business functions, participate in ERM program. Remember, when we start working on the questions, you will realize that some of these areas are very important at the exam because some are tricky questions, right? So these kind of topics, you need to have a clear understanding about each of these areas. So what are the functions responsible, or what are the functions participate in an ERM program? So as you can see, there is no regulatory requirement or a formula given that these functions must participate. But this is a typical situation, right? Typically, these are the functions participate in an ERM program. Strategic planning. As we all know, strategic planning is something that looks at the holistic picture of an organization and sets the overall direction of an organization. So therefore, that process involves looking at the organization holistically. And therefore, there's a requirement or mandate for that process to consider the organization as a whole. And so is ERM. Then the finance department because finance is also a function in an organization that has a holistic view and captures data all over the organization, and they can provide a lot of input to this risk management process, especially the financial details, including the capital, the earnings, all kinds of things. Therefore, there are also a team or a party or a division that needs to get involved. Thirdly, the risk departments, because as we try to get the holistic view, holistic position of the risk for the aggregation, we need to be able to collect this from different sectors, segments, and aggregate. So the respective risk departments, therefore, would be part of this process. Right. So with that, we conclude the 10th chapter. That is the last chapter. So we have discussed 10 chapters. So let me recall, right, the 10 chapters we discussed. We started with principles of risk management. The overall idea is a kind of a summary, and we discussed the basic concepts, terminology, and then we got a high-level understanding of what we are discussing in this course in the first chapter. And there you can remember that diagram that talks about how each risk components are connected each other and how it links with the external market and internal drivers, all that. Then we discussed international risk regulation. Especially we discussed about the role of BIS, Bank for International Settlements, and the 29 principles, etc. Then we talked about the operational risk, credit risk, market risk, investment risk, liquidity risk, and model risk. So we discussed individual risk components under each topic, and we went into details. Finally, today we discuss the need to look at risk holistically from an organizational point of view, which is termed as enterprise risk management or integrated risk management. So that told us how we look at the total picture, also paying attention to the interconnections. So with that topic, we conclude the total lessons, right, the theory part of this subject. And now, as I told you the other day, I'm going to start the questions or the past papers. Sorry, we don't look at past papers per se holistically, but we look at exam related questions. These are possible questions we can get from an exam point of view, and we will be discussing some of these areas that are similar to the exam type question. Right. So what I generally do, I start discussing about the questions chapter wise, so that we go in order for each chapter, and then we do a random pick. Right? We look at randomly a mix of questions, so that when we attempt these questions, we also look at how we identify or figure out the respective topic or the area of the questions. So when we do chapter wise, we know exactly where the questions are coming from. But in a mix is what is important, because at the exam, it doesn't show you different what do you call topics, right? So you should be able to figure out from which topic you get this question, right? So before I get into the questions, I would like to hear from you if any one of you have any questions, clarifications, starting from the last topic I did. Any other clarification on the topics before I get into the questions? Right. You can even use the chat box, right, if you are unable to talk. Right. If you don't have any questions, clarifications, let me shift to the questions. This is how it is done. I'm going to share the screen. So don't worry about, the answer. If you are not sure, you can still answer. We are learning. I'm just trying to show you how it works. So I'm going to show you the questions and answers, because this is multiple choice question answers. You need to give the answer. You can read the question and you can provide the answer. So I generally get the polling option enable, and then we can go with the poll. But until that is ready, we use the chat box. Right? So you can type the answer in the chat box. I'll show you the question. Now it is your time. I have done lecturing part. Now I'm expecting you to respond to this and see what is your knowledge level. Whenever you get a gap, we can then identify it. Right? If you are unable to answer, that means you have a learning in that particular area. So work on that. That's how it is done. Right. So I'm going to share the screen, and then you need to view your answer. Type the answer in the chat box. Okay. This is from the chapter 1, question 1. So you read the answer, type the answer. Right. Let's see. So most of you, I think almost everyone has given C as the answer. Yeah. What's the question? Which of the following is not included in the specific key areas of risk that affects sorry guys, financial services according to the password? Fund liquidity, asset liquidity, political risk, interest rate risk. Yes, your answer is correct. It is political risk. Good. Let's go to the question number 2. So I prefer if all of you can respond so that we know. Okay, that's fine. So be familiar, right? You can then get to know where you are when you know whether you have a homework on certain areas, if you are weak in certain aspects. Some of these things you don't need to know much about the theory. If you are comfortable, you can use your judgment and answer. Right, I can see in this one, we got answer B, D, A. We don't have C's. Yeah, most of the answers are those. So what's the question? A firm is attempting to understand the interaction between internal risk drivers and is assessing the risk it would face should there be a repeat of a major IT failure. This is an example, right? So if you assess situation, okay, what if we have an IT failure, what would be the situation? How are we dealing with it? So what is that? Scenario analysis, risk assessment workshop, SWOT analysis. Right? Stress testing. So what is scenario analysis? Scenario analysis is you're assuming a situation and then see what the situation, based on that, you look at the rest of the parameters, what will happen. So in this case, the given situation is the assessing the risk it would face, should there be a repeat of a major IT failure? If there's IT failure, what is the situation? And therefore, it is a risk, it is a scenario. This is about a scenario. You're looking at a scenario where there is a major IT failure. And other three answers are not going in line with it because risk assessment workshop is a different concept. SWOT analysis is nowhere there. Stress testing is you assume it is similar to scenario, but in the stress testing, what happens is you don't look at a situation or a scenario. You take one variable at a time. You assume that the interest rate will go up by X percentage. You assume that this will happen. So you take 1.1 parameter at a time, then that is a stress test. If you look at a particular situation, scenario, right, context, and then look at your situation, that is called scenario analysis. Right. So therefore the answer is A. Right. Question number 3, I'm going to launch the poll. The poll is ready. Right. So you can, I think you can see the poll. You can respond. Question number 3. Right. I've got 15 responses. So what does it say? Majority is saying C. Let me share the screen. Majority is saying C. So what's the question? Which type of external risk would arise from a scenario where major investors disagree on the direction being followed by the board? Which type of external risk? Economic risk, competition risk, stakeholder risk, political risk. Right. So when the investors disagree on the organization's direction, most probably the investors or the parties connected to the organization will bring in pressure. So they are stakeholders. So stakeholder is. So most of you have given the correct answer. So we'll go to the next question, question number 4.
So can you please take the cursor where we can't see the question?
Okay. Right, only 10 people have responded by now. Right, let's see. The question is, when considering a project in which the financial returns considerably outweigh the financial cost, the management staff should be involved from an early stage to ensure that profits are maximized so that costs do not increase, to satisfy regulatory requirements, to mitigate unforeseen problems. I think the answer is quite obvious, right? As most of you have given it correctly, it is D, right? I think out of the 14 respondents, 13 have given the correct answer. Right, let's go to the question number 5. Right, I have got 11 responses by now. Question number 5, let's see. The LIBOR scandal involving the manipulation of key benchmark rate can be seen as a manifestation of residual risk, inherent risk, risk culture, risk appetite. Right, understand the question. Right, LIBOR scandal involving the manipulation of key benchmark rates. That means the organization, the people have manipulated the limits. That's a benchmark you're supposed to follow. You don't follow it. So what is it? Residual, inherent, risk culture, risk appetite. So interestingly, I have got 12 answers, as you can see, equal responses for all the four questions for given answers. So the correct answer is C. It is the culture of the organization that they have a practice of doing it. Right? They, as an organization, that's what they think should do. Now you see, when it comes to practical application, how tricky the questions are. You need to know the meaning of these scenarios and address. Right, let's go to the next question. Six. Right, I've got 16 responses by now. We have more votes for A and D. What's the question? Which type of risk describes the risk that a firm still faces once it has taken actions to mitigate non-risk? That means even after taking actions to mitigate non-risk, you have a risk remaining. Now, as per the responses you all have given as I'll share it, right? You can see there is a confusion between the residual risk and the inherent risk. Inherent risk is the risk you face without considering the controls, right? Before you consider the controls, what are the risks? That is inherent. Residual risk is after considering the controls, after taking mitigation actions, there could be certain risks that will still remain. And that risk is called residual risk. So in this case, what it says is, which type of risk describes the risk that a firm still faces once it has taken actions to mitigate? So after taking actions to mitigate, you still face something that is called residual risk. Right? Don't confuse between the two. Right? Internal risk and residual risk. The answer is D. Right.
The answer is D or
Sorry. A.
A.
I made a mistake. Answer is A.
Thank you.
It is residual risk. Thank you for reminding me. Right. Now it's almost 8:30. We'll take a break and get back, and we'll continue the paper. And going forward, I'll get the office to share the paper in advance so that you have the paper with you when we do the class. Today we'll have to bear with me. Right. We did up to the 6th question. Let's go to the question number 7. Right, I've got 12 responses. Others are still voting, I think. Now, this is a bit of a tricky question. You need to read it carefully to understand. Right? Very tricky question. You need to read it carefully to understand. The question is, assessment of risk using pestle analysis typically involves which of the following? They are not asking about the pestle analysis. Right? What is pestle? The question is about when we do the pestle analysis, when we use pestle to assess risk, what are involved, right? Any steps or any concept, any aspect that is connected to pestle analysis process, right? A, business process analysis, likelihood probability rating, disaster recovery planning, brainstorming with internal and external experts. If you look at A, B, and C, all these 3 things are connected to internal assessments, right? It's internal. But if the last point is about brainstorming with internal and external experts. So you brainstorm with internal and external experts to identify the factors connected to pest analysis. When you do the pest analysis, you do that activity. But other three activities given are connected to the internal aspects. Therefore, the correct answer is D, right? Most of you have picked A as the answer, but the correct answer in this case is D. Read the question again, understand the expectation. Right. Let's go to the next question. Question number 8. Right, I've got 15 responses. The question is, a firm is unable to raise the new funds it needs to meet its obligations due to a tightening of credit market condition. This is an example of interest rate risk, market risk, funding liquidity risk, asset liquidity risk. I think it's clear. The answer is C, funding liquidity risk, and most of you have given the correct answer, except 3. I think you need to revisit the question. Right, let's go to the question number 9. Right, I've got 16 responses. Let's see the question. Which type of risk is most likely to lead a breach of FCA's treating customer fairly? Financial Conduct Authority. Default risk, financial risk, counterpart risk, conduct risk. I think the answer is obvious. So the word is already there. FCA. It is conduct risk. So answer is D. Most of you have given the correct answer. Right. Let's go to question number 10. Right. Let's see the question. Question number 10. Top-down and bottom-up approaches are typically associated with which one of the following risk concept, right? Both top-down, bottom-up. Risk ranking, risk appetite, risk profile, mitigation. So most of your answers are for risk ranking. So now it's very important to understand what is top-down and bottom-up. So we are looking at from two angles to arrive at what the risk ranking is. Basically, once you identify the risk, you look at the severity of the risk and then see which one is relatively high risk, and then you arrange it. Risk appetite is determining how much risk you can tolerate or can buy. Risk profile is what is the risk that organization is currently exposed to, right? It's a kind of a picture of what the current situation is. Mitigation is taking actions against risk. So if you look at all of them, so between A and B, there's a battle. So A is about ranking, B is about appetite. So if you look at the reality, this top-down, bottom-up approaches are used mostly when it comes to setting risk appetite, because you look at from both angles and see how much you can tolerate. So the answer is B. Some of you have given, but majority has given A. Right? The correct answer is B, appetite. Question number 11. Right, let's see the question. I've got 17 responses. Varying input factors one at a time to assess the internal risk is an example of scenario testing, scenario analysis, stress testing, risk workshop, test analysis. I think the answer is obvious. It is stress testing. Most of you have given the correct answer. Right, answer is B. Right, good. Let's go to the next one. Question number 12. Right. Question number 12. The question, what term is used to describe the assessment of risk without considering the effects of mitigating controls? I have discussed this previously, the difference between the two. So that is inherent risk we discussed earlier.
So can you give an example for residual risk and inherited risk?
Okay. So inherent risk is, let's say, when you have deployed a person who has no adequate knowledge about the subject to work on something. So there is a risk that this person will make a mistake, right? So the control would be, you can implement a review process. Someone else will review the work of that person. So that risk is mitigated through that. So that is an example of inherent risk and control mitigation. So the residual risk is, say for example, you have given a loan of 100,000. The mitigation is you have taken a collateral. The collateral value is 80,000. Now there's an exposure of 20. So after taking the mitigation action, you still have an exposure of 20. So that is residual risk. Example. There are a lot of examples you can use. I just gave you something that you can understand. Okay. Right. So the answer to this one is D. Okay. Most of you have given the answer correctly. Thirteen. Right. I still have 12 responses. So let's see anyway. The question is, which of the following types of risk is considered the most difficult to qualify? Market risk, strategic risk, investment risk, credit risk. I think we've discussed this as well at the beginning. It is the strategic risk. So there's a typo here. I think it's not qualify, it should be quantify, right? I think the question, there's a problem. The answer is strategic risk, B. That is one of the reasons why we don't use it in the analysis, because you can't quantify. Right. Question number 40. Right, I've got 16 responses. Let's see what the question is. Hedging against the market risk is typically associated with which of the following risk concepts? Risk ranking, risk tolerance, risk profile, risk mitigation. The answer is obvious. That is, this hedging is an option to use as a mitigation measure. So you are trying to address the risk. Right, so the answer is D. So yeah, except few, most of you have given the correct answer. Let's go to the next question, 15. Right, I've got 20 responses for this one. Right. The question is, which of the following is an example of external risk, operational risk, strategic risk, financial risk, cyber risk? Absolutely. Except one person, 19 people have responded the correct one. That is D, cyber risk. Good. So let's go to the next question quickly. 16. Right, I've got 16 responses by now. The question is, the type of risk associated with the earnings of a company as a result of adverse changes in the business environment or business decisions is called as class test, political, strategic, operational, financial. Read it again. Type of risk associated with the earnings of a company as a result of adverse changes in the business environment. Adverse changes in the business environment, right? Or business decisions. Either the environment has changed, therefore you cannot get the results, or your decisions are not taken in the right shape. What is that? That is strategic risk. We discussed that, right? Remember, go back and see the definition of strategic risk. The answer is B, right? Answer is B, strategic risk. Seventeen. but I've got 15 responses by now. You see the question. Requirements to have in place resolution plans introduced by the Prudential Regulatory Authority and other international regulators aim to address which of the following risks? Operational, systemic, market, legal. Now understand the question again, right? Requirement to have in place resolution plans introduced by the Prudential Regulatory Authority, PRA, and other international regulators aim to address which of the following risks. So remember, these regulators, when they try to have these resolutions, they're looking at Prudential Regulatory Authority, right? So they need to have resolution plans. That means when a bank or any organization fails, you need to have this kind of controls to make sure that it doesn't cascade down. What do you mean by that? If one bank fails, it can affect the other banks. This is called systemic risk, right? Systemic risk. If a fall of a bank causes the fall of the entire industry because one will affect the other, that is called the systemic effect. So the risk of that is called systemic risk. That is why we sometimes identify certain banks as systemically important banks, because if such banks fail, it can affect the entire industry. So here the answer therefore is systemic risk, right? They are trying to have these controls to ensure that there is no systemic risk. Answer is B. Okay, next question, question number 18. Right, let's see the question. Which of the following factors can be attributed to political risk? Failure to anticipate downturn in demand for services, regulatory changes in markets in which the firm is invested, competitor gaining market share, changes in house prices resulting from demographic changes. Yes, the correct answer is B, regulatory changes. So yeah, most of you have given the correct answer. Let's have, there are two more questions. We'll finish it today. We'll quickly go to the next 90.
So excuse me, previous answer you said is B.
18.
18th.
18 B, second one.
Second one. No, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Regulatory. That is in the control of the politician. Right, I've got 12 responses. Let's see the question. Which type of risk event typically has less repeatable data that can be grouped and analyzed? Market risk, strategic risk, default risk, counterparty risk. Again, you should be able to answer this, read the question well. Which type of risk event typically has less repeatable data? That means these things typically might not have repeated data because things change, right? So if you look at the given four, strategic risk probably has this because strategies changed every time. So you may not be able to find same information over and over because strategies change, right? Situations change. Therefore, with the given list of things, the correct one is strategic risk. Right, that is B. The last question, we'll try this and then finish the class. 20th. So I would like everyone to respond to this and give the correct answer. Close it with the good note. Right, so I've got 16 responses. 17, yeah. The type of risk associated with the loss caused by inadequate or failed internal processes, people and systems or from external event is market risk, operational risk, credit risk, asset liquidity. I think it is the easiest question we had today. This is the definition of operational risk. So the correct answer is B. Right, so with that, we conclude the questions. So we will do this exercise for the next topics as well. So we will share the questions in advance so that you can come prepared. So let's try to go fast so that you can finish more questions. So likewise, we will have chapter-wise questions, and then later we have mixed papers with random questions to master. So as I told you, you need to make use of this opportunity to brush your knowledge and clarify your doubts and get the concept correctly, right? Those who could not catch with the theory, this is the chance to get the clarity. So therefore, please engage and get the best out of it. Right, we'll see you next week then. Good night.
Good night, sir.
Sir,
Thank you.
good night, sir. Thank you.
Good night and thank you.